Good morning to all of you. Let me count exactly 20 minutes because I know Femi is tough. I'm going to concentrate on some of the major global trends of urbanization, why there is a need to measure sustainable urban development, how we have conceptualized prosperity and sustainability as part of our work, how we connect this to the main objective of this conference, which is street connectivity analysis and public space, and which is the future of this kind of metrics and policy dialogues connections. Some of the major global trends. Because of time, obviously, I'm just going to highlight them. All this is part of the work of UN Habitat worldwide at city level. Number one, if you take all cities from the world, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, all cities have grown 3 times more in terms of spatial, physical growth of what they needed. 3 times more means obviously more consumption of land, of energy, of environment, etc. We don't have time to explain this. We could do it in another time. Because of this growth, if you take 20 years ago, Habitat 2 conference that Thomas was mentioning, today, nearly 20 years, 75% of cities in the world, again from the north to the south, east and west, all cities have grown more unequal. In other words, you have 75% of the urban population living in places that are today with less capacities to distribute the benefits of urbanization. All this, and one of the important reasons, is because of serious distortions in the form of and the functionality of the city. And this is exactly what we are going to talk about. And also, obviously, that affects the environment, but we have forgotten a fundamental agenda that is the intangible agenda. Public, identity, collective. All these values of solidarity are fundamental part of sustainable development. And we will talk about of them soon. Cities grow, cities expand. Why they do that? One, because the model of urbanization has been distorted by a notion of prosperity that is founded on the notion of financial short-term gains. Second fundamental reason, up to now, and we need to recognize, especially since the 60s, 70s, the loss between the public and the private, the public realm has been lost, or is being lost. A model that is not sustainable. How we can measure that cities are in the path of more sustainable development? How we can measure that prosperity is shared by all the inhabitants of the cities? And this is exactly what the UN Habitat has done since 2002. We have to try to look for a different model of urbanization that is transformative in nature, transformative in the way that it is not any longer sectoral but holistic. It's centered in people, it's inclusive, and it's sustainable. A model, as I said, that would integrate into separate notion of tangible and intangible values of the city. A model that will change the form and the functionality of the city. But what do we need for that? We need to reconceptualize what does it mean for us sustainability. And some of the fundamental aspects of sustainability is that we need cities that are more compact. We need cities that use much more energy. Cities, obviously, that have, as Peter mentioned in his introduction, a much better connection of different social groups interacting in the city. Heterogeneity, diversity is fundamental for this city. A city that protects his inhabitants, different kind of shocks, different kind of risks. A city, and this is our fundamental point, that provides and protects public goods, common goods. All this brings, when a city like this is being transformed into these elements, will have a certain number of positive outcomes. You can see them, no need to, because of time, to go to them in detail. This is the idea of prosperity. We have conceptualized this, but it's not UN Habitat who has decided this. We have asked in 54 countries, cities in the world, 2,000 people, tell us what a prosperous city means. 11 items that we ask, and to our surprise, the world told us basically the same thing. As you can see, 5 elements were conceptualized as the most important for prosperity. The landscape of intensity of responses can change in Africa or Asia, as you can see in terms of level of responses. What doesn't change is what they have considered as the most important elements. A city needs to have quality of life, needs to be productive, infrastructure, equity, and environmentally sustainability. We have conceptualized, and this is the work of UN Habitat, in a metaphoric way, something that local authorities, the mayor, those that take decisions, can steer growth, can change the path, can move the city to another direction. This movement can only be done if at the center of these powers, you have the capacity of local authorities to steer growth. Then the city can be completely overturned for a positive path of development. This is what we are expecting to do. We transform all these measurements, because they are measurements with different indicators that we will see, in a very simple spider graph, where you can see cities, look, Vienna, Cairo, Nairobi, where we live, will be rated against these dimensions of prosperity, 0 being the health of prosperity, and 1, the heaven of prosperity. And you will see Vienna close in all the different dimensions, but the more you move to developing cities and countries, the more distorted the different values and dimensions are. And as you can see, for instance, Nairobi, low productivity, relatively well, infrastructure more or less, etc. So we have, as we work and we progress 2013 and 14, integrated new dimensions of prosperity. Now we have not 5, if we talk about a wheel, a spoke, we have 6, we have integrated the notion of governance among all these elements. And the idea is that in cities we can measure the intensity or the way cities are progressing in sustainability and prosperity with the basic indicators of CPI, which means City Prosperity Index. We will move to extended one, in which the important is not to compare cities among them in the world, but to look much more in detail how they are performing, and a contextual one in which we integrate policy actions, policy outcomes. The City Prosperity Index has done a major change, quantitative change in the last year. We have integrated what we call space-related indicators, spatial indicators, economic agglomerations, recent densities, and the street connectivity notion. This is the one that we are going to talk about. All indicators, all dimensions, just for you to understand, have, for instance, the productivity subdimensions like economic growth, agglomeration, employment, and a set of indicators that we measure. Economic agglomeration being one of these spatial indicators. Same thing, and street connectivity, as you can see, is a composed number of 3 indicators that will tell you how well connected, how efficient the form and functionality the city is. We measure the land that cities allocate to streets, we measure the density of these streets, and the intersections. All this gives values about the cities. In order to do that, we need to understand that measurements require boundaries in order to know when you say compared to the total surface of the area, and boundaries are not easy to define. They are not easy because you have a lot of fragmented interstitial spaces. You have metastasis of urban development. So we work on this. And just to illustrate, one of the indicators for equity, for instance, is the slum indicator. This is my own city in Mexico, Guadalajara. You have the core part of the city, 4% of slums. And then you have one of the municipalities at the outskirts of the city, 21%. The important thing for us is not the value, which is the average, 10%, is to understand the intercity dynamics, is to understand how cities perform inside the different historic physical spaces. The conference is good, you are vibrating. Public space is one of these indicators. Here, we are just developing this, a question. We don't have time to discuss this, but you see these kind of dots which are pink. Those are identified polygons of public areas, and we have measured the area that this will cover in 300 meters of 1,000 meters around, and the white parts will be the parts of the city that inhabitants in this particular city, in Mexico, for instance, will not be covered for public space. What the book is telling us in terms of the street connectivity, I have just 10 minutes and I'm going to focus on this. The first important one, you would say it's almost intuitive, it's simple, but it's not. It's based on evidence, it's based on empirical knowledge of today, 150 cities in the world. We know that if you talk about prosperity, if you talk about equity, if you talk about sustainability, you need to integrate the form, the planning, the structure of the city. In the past, just recently, 2002, most of the indicators were society-oriented indicators, and the space was considered an element like a platform where things were happening. Today, we know, and this is the bit that we are doing, that the space had become a vector of change by itself. And being a vector of change, we need to see how to manage. In the new analysis, we have integrated, that will be on top of this diagram, the connectivity index, and you will see the street connectivity is higher, the prosperity index will be higher. Simple, but you will see another interesting thing. These are only cities from the developed world. And the main conclusion is that a street in the last 40 years have become what theoreticians call an inferior public good. Why inferior? The definition of inferior good is that as GDP or per capita income increases, the use and the consumption of the public goods do not increase, reduce value. And this is exactly what is happening with the streets and public spaces. If you see, these are all cities from developed world, but when you move from the big bars to the smallest ones, it means that you move from the center of the city to the periphery. In most places of the world, both developing and developing world, from 90 to 70, the streets have reduced by half when you move to the peri-urban areas. Only half of connectivity of cities. Poor connectivity affects all dimensions of prosperity. And more influentially, we have seen in our analysis equity and quality of life. But it affects all. Not only that, but connectivity doubles in terms of metrics, the distance and the cost of moving from one place to another. You can see here from the poorest, less developed city that we have in our Bangui in Central Africa to Hong Kong, the proportion of cities moves from 8 to 30%. And in this gradient of access to streets and public spaces, you will see that in those cities, African cities mostly, some from Asia, that have very low level of streets, you have also absence of footpaths, absence of public areas. As you move to intermediate, still poor countries, you will see that most of the slums, some exceptions in the world, some Latin American exceptions, they lack street connectivity. And as you move to intermediate income countries, streets are only links, are only places to move from point A to point B, but they lack all what Peter was mentioning in terms of the values, the aspects, the economic, the social, the cultural, the political. And when you move to the newer areas, you will see that all of them, few exceptions, all developing countries, new areas are underserved. And something interesting, just to look at this is Nairobi. You will see that the richest area of Nairobi and the poorest, which is the Kibera slums, both have the same proportion of streets, 3%, but obviously different intensity. I have like 8 minutes, I think, and I'm going to conclude this with some elements. I wanted to show to you, you have 4 cities from Mexico, UN Habitat, and this is the work of our colleagues in the planning department, that are telling us which are the recommended values for streets, for densities, for intersections, which will be the green part at the bottom of this. And you will see that cities in Mexico are close to these values in general, the cities that we have analyzed. But let's take only one city, and this is the new work of UN Habitat. You have the values there, but when you analyze the city now, disaggregated at the urban spatial level, you will see that the center of the city, intersection density is very low, compared with the recommendations. But if you move now to the informal settlements, something very rare you can see here, that the intersection density multiplies by 3, which means that these spaces are wasteful in the streets, and they lack public space. And in this case, the street is not what it should be, a public space by itself. It's just a link. And then this wasteful part of the street is not really helping us to look gated communities in the same city. Intersection density reduces again dramatically, and also other values of this. Now you take the state mass social housing in these places, and you will see that densities are extremely low and intersection densities, as you can see in this map. Why this analysis is today important to us, and I would like to conclude with the time. The new work that we are doing, in addition to these 100 and something pages, and is moving to the new phase of the analysis, is that in the same city you have I'm illustrating here 6 different space areas that we are going to compare across the world in terms of center, periphery, rural, urban periphery for the rich, and we will see the values of the street and the public space. And we are going to compare to economic densities. Economic densities will tell us if the firms, the industries, the economic activities are connected to the form of the city or not. And we found, for instance, in the city that we are analyzing, that where industrial areas and where the maximum of firms of industrial development are, is one of the lowest connectivity of the city. And that's why you would see high congestion, inefficiencies, and you will see negative externalities a lot in the city, accidents, etc. This connection between economies of agglomeration, residential densities, and street connectivity will bring for the first time at the global level and the intersection of different spatial indicators in which we can connect to policy decisions in order to see how to make more efficient the cities. This is the work of UN Habitat with these dimensions, and I thank you, and I think I respected my time. Thanks.